Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good, I don't know, early breakfast, late breakfast. We are really actually combining many time zones today. So just to say this. So it's an immense pleasure for me to welcome you to the second webinar of the Summer Academy series. The Summer Academy this year is focusing on the topic of social protection and climate change. It's a joint project actually by the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, by the UNFCCC Secretariat, by the MCRI initiative, as well as LMU, which is the university in Munich. And we are bringing together experts and also early career fellows on topics of adaptation futures and world risk and adaptation futures. So this is actually the third year of this particular series, and I'm happy that we are actually talking about the topic of social protection and climate change. Today we will have the chance to get closer discussions and deep dives on a concept called adaptive social protection. And I'm delighted because we are able to combine it also with some of our initiatives that are happening at the Institute. So we will have higher political echelon from Indonesia, and we will also have additional experts joining us. And through that, I think we will be able to maybe have some deep conversation around the concept and the conceptual understanding of adaptive social protection, but also to see what is actually the potential towards resilience, and maybe also be able to see how can a country actually exert its leadership and implement adaptive social protection approaches. So these kind of real-world examples, as well as conceptual debates, I think is something which very much excites me. Quick words on myself. I'm Sönke Kreft. I'm the Executive Director of MCI and also head of section at United Nations University, and I will be the moderator for today. Before we get started, actually, I would quickly ask Thomas Loster of Munich Re Foundation to give us a quick welcome speech. Munich Re Foundation has been a long-standing partner of the Academy. They are driving its content, and they are also sponsoring the event. So Thomas, over to you for a quick welcome speech.
Thank you, Sönke. Good morning, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Summer Academy. Sönke, we are not only a stable partner, we have initiated the Academy, and we are the founders 15 years ago together with UNU EHS. And as said, this is the 15th Academy of this type. This is also the biggest one because, as a rule, we only have some 30 young professionals, decision makers, practitioners. This time we are having over 100 due to Corona. In the digital format, of course, many more people can join us. It's a pity that we cannot come to Indonesia. Our World Conference on Inclusive Insurance, Microinsurance, was in Jakarta back in 2013, and this time we can't come, and it's a pity, and I'm very sad about this. Speaking about Indonesia, I want to thank Penas and GIZ Indonesia to be our partner, and now a really big thank you goes back to you, Sönke, for your contributions and for getting the partners together. Your team has done a tremendous job in order to get us all to the Indonesian focus of the Academy, and I'm really thankful that we have a real country in which where we can prove that the Academy is creating fruitful results. So this time, as said, we have many more scientists and friends, and hopefully these guys all meet after our meetings virtually. And so we have, due to Corona, not only limitations because we cannot travel, but we also have a great chance to get richer solutions because of many more brains are paying into the format. So good luck to the Academy. Again, thank you, dear partners, dear friends from Indonesia, and I wish the Academy great luck and the participants interesting sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Excellent. And I will just quickly explain the format of the session. So we will have 2 keynote interventions. And then afterwards, we will actually have a panel discussion. And there is ample space also for contributing to that. So you have the chat function of the Zoom webinar, but you can also use the Twitter handle SA2020 to submit your questions. And this event is actually live broadcasted on Facebook. And it will also be made available after the session on YouTube, and will be promoted under the hashtag of the Summer Academy. Just to give that. And before we actually listen to our first 2 keynotes, I would want to give you a quick introduction into the concept of adaptive social protection. So just that we are in a way on the same page, and that we have a little bit of background, and then we will hear our 2 keynote interventions. Okay, so what is actually meant by adaptive social protection? So this is a definition partially from the literature, but we also combine different scientific definitions into one. So adaptive social protection aims at assuring and promoting people's resilience in the face of multiple covariant risks induced by natural and climate hazards. And it does so by integrating social protection, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk management. So you will see different keywords popping up. We are talking about resilience of people. We are talking about different forms of risks, being climatic hazards, but also other forms of risks. And we are talking about covariant risks. So especially not, say, individual life cycle risk of people, but maybe the bigger shocks that really impact entire societies or impact entire communities. I just have to use the clicker. I'm sorry for that. Next slide, please. The clicker doesn't work. Okay, thank you. Just to give you some examples why this might be an interesting conceptual approach. If you, for example, look at heat stress, this definitely is an interplay of different drivers. We are talking about climate change, we are talking about urbanization, demographic change, factors of vulnerabilities. So in order to address that, actually different sectoral approaches need to be brought together. And this is a potential of adaptive social protection. Next slide, please. I also said essentially, it's an integration discussion. It brings together views from social protection with its element of social inclusion, social assistance, social insurance, and also poverty alleviation, with other sectoral views, namely that of disaster risk management. And from the disaster risk management side, we have concepts and views on, say, risks, including its dimension of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And we also have the climate change adaptation debate playing into adaptive social protection, with its long-term views on resilience and adapting to the long-term effects of climate change. So as you can see, it brings together different communities under one common goal, and it integrates different methods and approaches towards that common goal. So I hope this provides us with some understanding, and I would now hand over to our first keynote speaker. So it's an immense pleasure to introduce to you our Honorable Deputy Minister, Dr. Pungky Sumadi. He definitely is one of the drivers behind that debate in Indonesia. I think he will tell us more about it in a second. He has a background in urban planning, and he has hold different high esteem career position within the Ministry for Population and Development Planning in Indonesia over the past years. Our Honorable Deputy Minister, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, yeah. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the organizing committee of the Academy, Mr. Thomas Loster, Chairman of Munich Re Foundation, Koko Warner from UNFCCC, Ibu Aya, my partner from GIZ Indonesia, colleagues from MCII and the Institute of Environment and Human Security at the United Nations University, distinguished resource persons, academia, experts, CSOs, development partners, donors, ladies and gentlemen. Natural disasters in Indonesia have been more frequent, more severe, and the impact is detrimental to the livelihoods, particularly of most vulnerable groups. We are located in the Ring of Fire and within the vicinity of the equatorial line. The country experiences volcanic eruption, earthquakes, landslides, tsunamis, hydrometeorological disasters more frequently compared to other parts of the world. Between 2000 and 2016, Indonesia faced economic loss by approximately about 17 billion US dollars due to these natural disasters, according to the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. Households often experience harmful coping mechanisms. Low-income families usually reduce their consumption level, sell productive assets, and make harmful decisions related to health and education. Furthermore, communities most of the time do not have standard protocols to cope with the shocks due to natural disasters. On the national level, the government of Indonesia is often focused and forced to use a long-term budget for recovery and reconstruction. That is threatening our sustainable development planning and development financing capability. In addition to natural disasters, climate change will continue to affect Indonesia, intensifying the impacts of natural disasters. There are also risks of social and health disasters, like we are having now, COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, and it has impacted the country's economy badly. Bappenas, my office, projected 4 million people would fall into poverty in the absence of a well-designed social protection program. The situation suggests the importance of a more organized plan for the government of Indonesia in disaster response. Many of the ministries and agencies involved in the fields of social protection, disaster risk management, and climate change adaptation, they are still operating independently. This sectoral and siloed situation is a huge challenge in addressing vulnerability and exposure to disaster risk in a coherent and coordinated structure. As an example, many social assistance programs during the COVID-19 pandemic now were initiated through various ministries that traditionally never conduct social protection programs. The lack of standard protocol and coordination in facing the emergency created inefficient and less effective interventions. While most people receive bits of help, some are still left behind and the impacts of the support are often limited. We should push stronger coordination among social protection, disaster risk management, and climate change action communities to develop adaptive social protection, or ASP. ASP will be a strategic approach to streamline, harmonize, and coordinate different social protection interventions in the context of disaster and climate risks. With support from GIZ Social Protection Program, the Ministry of National Development Planning has been working closely to construct the roadmap, which includes the optimal designs of adaptive social protection programs, disaster response protocols, funding mechanisms, institutional framework, regulations, and governance arrangements. Let me touch some of the challenges of ASP development in Indonesia. We have semi-fragmented social protection system. Coordination tools are in place, but the policy processes of social protection programs have not been fully integrated, including during disaster events. Incomplete database to support disaster mitigation is another story. The current database has not included instruments to define disaster risk faced by communities. Therefore, it cannot provide full support in identifying impacted population groups. We also have rigid existing social protection programs. The current programs' designs are quite complicated and challenging to expand or adjust quickly in an emergency. Scientific knowledge is needed to address these challenges. Support from evidence-based policy development are required to encourage better coordination between agencies. Innovative approaches are crucial to help the Indonesian government in developing a disaster supportive database and expanding adaptive social protection to the remote areas. The process of composing the roadmap for ASP is a strategic moment for the government of Indonesia to collaborate with partners and other countries to develop the most appropriate design. The ideal ASP design will allow the government to ensure protection to the most vulnerable population groups in facing disaster risk. Such a strategy will improve the resilience of the poor and vulnerable, enable the government to deploy social protection quickly when needed, and support the impacted groups to recover from the disaster impacts. A sustainable financial mechanism should also support the ASP design. Let me end my remarks by thanking distinguished lecturers and participants of the summer school today for sharing their expertise and knowledge to take part in discussions and hopefully can provide feedback and inputs. Thank you very much. Back to you, Songke.
Thank you very much. I really liked that you actually framed the discussion and also were able to say why an adaptive social protection approach from a country perspective is needed. And I think this really should be a strong framework also for the discussions moving forward. With that, I would actually invite our second keynote panelist to quickly deliver her viewpoints. So I'm equally delighted to have Valentina Barca with us. She is an international expert on social protection. She has more than 10 years of experience and she has done quite remarkable work, for example, for the World Bank, but also for WFP's shock responsive social protection work. Please, Valentina, give us your view on how adaptive social protection can make a difference.
Fantastic. I fear my share screen function has been disabled. In the test, it was enabled. I'm happy for you to share it on your side, or if you could make me a presenter.
Yeah, we'll do just a second.
Fantastic. And in the meanwhile, thank you so much, Pungky Sumadi, for helping to frame this from a real world perspective. And I feel like, yeah, I'll be able to build on what you've said and touch on a lot of the elements that you discussed there. Fantastic. I'm able to share my screen now. Okay. Are you able to see it?
Yes,
okay.
At least the panel does.
Great. Okay, so I'll be discussing this concept of moving from a reactive to a more proactive social protection approach, and I'll be building on a lot of existing resources along the way, and I've provided links for these within the presentation, and this includes a recent Transform manual on shock responsive social protection, the World Bank adaptive social protection work, and work I've been doing within this space social protection approaches to COVID-19 team, where we've been supporting 25 plus countries think through their COVID response, building on their existing systems. And in your introduction, you kind of very clearly showed that interlinkages of those three circles, and I've added another one here, humanitarian. And Pak Sumadi also mentioned the silo problem. But why is this such a problem? And kind of for me, coming from the social protection sector and for many years just working on social protection within social welfare ministries in different countries, you slowly build your own world, and that world does not intersect with the world of people working in other sectors. We've studied at different universities. We're referring to different conceptual frameworks. We're kind of studying, we're consulting different websites, we're writing in different journals, we're using different acronyms and sort of that in language that becomes typical of a sector. And we end up feeling overwhelmed and lost kind of when we start working with people working in other sectors. But the more we start doing that, the more kind of over the years, myself and colleagues working on shock responsive and adaptive social protection, the more we venture into the worlds of our colleagues, the more we realize that there's massive overlaps between these, and actually being able to start speaking the languages of the other sectors and putting those glasses on and sort of helps to focus and achieve the outcomes for our sector more effectively, because ultimately we're focusing on the needs of at-risk or affected populations. And within social protection, our core mandate is to address poverty and vulnerability, no matter how these are generated, whether it's the kind of idiosyncratic or covariate shock, as you were mentioning in the introduction. And our toolboxes are often overlapping, or at least they're complementary. We're using very similar approaches to be able to achieve outcomes, so why work separately? And for the social protection sector, and I know this will sound incredibly obvious for many others, this has meant starting to look at social protection through the lens of thinking about risks and shocks, and realizing that the number, the severity, the duration of recent humanitarian crises has been on the rise over the past 30 years. Over 80% of kind of countries where humanitarian support is provided are actually protracted long-term crises. And these have come to play a large, increasing role in determining people's life outcomes, with ultimately the poor and most vulnerable being most affected, as you were saying before, Pak Sumadi. And broadly, many of these are actually predictable, recurrent, protracted shocks. They're overlapping. They're things that we can start thinking through in advance. We don't have to constantly be reacting to something that catches us by surprise. And what does this mean for our sector, for social protection actors, is we're very much grounded in ILO recommendation 202 on building social protection floors, thinking about life cycle risks at every stage of the life cycle, early childhood, school age, youth, all the way up to old age. And for each of those risks faced at different stages, we have different programs that help complementarily, ideally, to be addressing those risks. So child grants for early childhood, you can think of scholarship and school feeding for school age, and so on and so forth, across social assistance, social insurance, and active labor market policies. And the thing is that covariate shocks play a role across all of these, and they're compounding those risks. And unless we acknowledge that, and kind of our sector has started to think about how to be able to avoid and sort of prepare, cope, and adapt as a system, kind of as a sector, and make sure that the households and individuals we're supporting are able to prepare, cope, and adapt. And so ultimately, this pans out in two ways, depending on our country. There's some type of cyclical, recurrent, predictable events, which they're being treated as shocks, but they're not actually shocks, and that the social protection sector should be considering these their core mandate. I'm thinking about recurrent droughts, cyclones, as you were mentioning before. They're high frequency, sometimes low severity, sometimes high severity, but they're shocks which we know they will happen, and our sector needs to be behaving in a way that takes this fully into consideration and taking ownership, taking that risk on board. But of course, if we're designed and prepared to do so, we can also help achieve improved outcomes and better meet the needs of vulnerable or affected populations alongside other sectors for other types of shocks as well. And COVID is an example. No one really was expecting something of this magnitude. So ultimately, this better meeting people's needs and before or after a shock, adaptive social protection is about understanding that we need to be covering everyone in need when they're in need. This timeliness concept is not about necessarily, it's also about being swift and rapid, and many of the COVID responses weren't swift enough to help people at the stage where they needed it before they'd recur to those negative coping strategies that Pak Sumadi was mentioning. But it's also about supporting people at the time when they're in need, even in advance of a shock. The adequacy of support, providing enough support and the right type of support that's actually addressing people's needs, and comprehensiveness, addressing different risks, the different multidimensional risks that people are covering, that are facing complementarily, and doing this in a way across sectors that can be cost effective, so that we're not kind of stepping on each other's toes, and that each of us investing in systems that are not used by the other sectors, ensuring accountability to affected populations, being predictable, and prioritizing this longer term sustainability, not just coming in, inventing the wheel, coming in, inventing the wheel. And of course, this is a fantastic wish list of outcomes. There's trade-offs between these. It's not possible to always achieve these, but any policy decision needs to be based on thinking through these and how they work against each other, and taking that decision comprehensively. And ultimately, for the social protection sector, this means strengthening routine systems, because a stronger system, a stronger set of programs that work together to address people's risks will provide a better support kind of in situations of risks, no matter what. And again, the stronger systems were the ones that were better able to respond to COVID in the COVID response. But also just slight adaptations, design tweaks, so that we do what we already do, but doing it better, incorporating, understanding the risks, shocks, and stressors that your country typically face, and making slight changes to your targeting criteria, including some climate change related criteria, for example, small adaptations to your public works programs. So you're looking at adaptation outcomes as well. And so apart from that, then C, kind of the biggest step is that coordinating, working together with other sectors that are mandated to respond and support kind of in cases of shocks, to build on our existing social protection systems, work alongside them, and maybe have these vertical, horizontal expansions, which I'm sure you might have heard about if you've engaged with any of the concept of shock responsive social protection. And building on what, ultimately within the social protection sector, we have a set of tools and programs, and we can think of this in terms of 3 building blocks. At policy level, we need to be thinking creatively about financing, and Pak Sumadi, you mentioned this as well. We need to be making sure that our legal and policy framework is actually focused on the risks that our country typically face, and making sure that different legal and policy frameworks across sectors speak to each other, coordinating across sectors, making sure that the design of our programs in terms of the targeting, the eligibility criteria, the qualifying conditions, the transfer types, the frequency, the duration, that we're thinking about these in terms of the risks that we might be facing in the future. And then the delivery of our programs, kind of outreach and communications, registering beneficiaries, enrolling them, paying them, again, strengthening those systems. Pak Sumadi mentioned the kind of information management and registration system in Indonesia has made enormous strides forward, but it didn't hold up to a shock of this entity. It provided a very important function in the COVID response, but there's a lot that can be done to strengthen these systems and make sure we're prepared for future shocks. So ultimately, for the social protection sector, it's this exercise of thinking about shocks, thinking about the shock cycle. What can we be doing before? Assessing our routine systems to strengthen those, starting to build those protocols, standard operating procedures, know what we'll be doing if and when something will happen in the future, thinking about triggers and early warning and relief from all of that kind of very important work from the DRM sector, thinking about what we will be doing in the aftermath, and operationalizing all of that in coordination arrangements across those sectors. But even that is not enough, because ultimately, if we just zoned into any specific shock, we'd be missing the bigger picture. And for especially in terms of climate change and longer trends, those multiple overlapping shocks, this shift from firefighting to system building and thinking through how things might change and how we want to strengthen our system today so that we're better placed in the future. There's a great report that came out just 2 days ago from the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Oliver de Schutter, where he actually used a sentence which you use in this event on rethinking our political choices about social protection to prioritize the most vulnerable and providing proactive and systemic and not reactive and ad hoc responses to protect population. We are all potential recipients of social protection because we might all be in need. So thank you very much, and I've provided quite a few resources here for those who are curious to see more. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent, Valentina, and really, I think first you helped us unpacking the topic very much. Also, kind of the technical clarity around some of the concepts, and also linking it to the COVID-19 situation. I think it's a real world example that we have right now. We are talking about bringing different forms of risk together, and then maybe the last point on saying for whom it matters, the most vulnerable, and I think this is really one of the guiding notion. So I would actually now want to introduce you to the panel part of the seminar, and I will quickly introduce the different panelists. So let me start maybe with Dr. Koko Warner. She joined me here in Bonn, so we actually have a semi-virtual event. I hope we can handle that. Koko is the manager of impacts, vulnerability, and risks at UN Climate Change, the UNFCCC Secretariat. They're also based here in Bonn, Germany. She has a background as an economist. She also worked as an IPCC lead author, so she can give us that perspective as well. And previously she has worked on topics relevant to climate loss and damage, but also some of the technical approaches, for example, climate risk insurance and things like that. The next panelist will be, next slide, please. Yeah, will be Sri Rozanna from Indonesia. She really is one of the powerhouses. I cannot use a different word on the topic. She works for GIZ as a principal advisor, and she has had several senior positions, including also as part of the Aceh Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Program more than 15 years ago, when the big tsunami stroke the Indonesian coast. And she is overseeing the, as a program director, the social protection program in Indonesia, which is supporting Bappenas, the Ministry of Planning. And finally, we also have our own Dr. Simone Sandholm with us. She's a senior researcher at UNU EHS. She has a background in geography and represents very much also the disaster risk management perspective in the project. She works on vulnerability and risk reduction, and she is a co-lead of eco-disaster risk reduction within the IOCN. And then also I kindly ask our previous keynote speakers to also join the panel, at least virtually, and also pick up some questions. Before we actually start with the Q&A session, and I already see that several questions are coming in. So I'm asking everyone to think about, maybe also think about the framing intervention you heard in the beginning, and please type in your questions and comments into the Zoom chat function, or submit them over Twitter. But before I do that, I'll ask a few questions to the panelists. So let me start maybe with you, Koko. So you are very much representing the climate side of things, I would say, right now in your current capacities. And you saw that adaptive social protection is actually integrating different perspectives. So what do you think the climate perspective can bring to the table? And what does it have to do in managing the vulnerabilities of people?
Thanks a lot, Sunke. Good morning and afternoon and evening to everyone. It's been such a pleasure. Vice Minister and also Valentina, loved listening to you and your experiences and knowledge. You know, when it comes to climate change, if you look at the IPCC work in recent assessments, such as the 5th assessment report and what's going on now with the 6th assessment report, climate impacts and vulnerabilities are really shaped or really discussed in the context of risk. And Valentina and Vice Minister Sumadi both pointed this out. With risks, we have often physical, but not only physical disruptions. You have exposure, and this is often in specific places over more or less specific amounts of time, although that's changing with climate change. And then perhaps most important, you have people and their characteristics, and we call that vulnerability. How susceptible is a group of people to these shocks and disruptions in the places they live and work at certain phases of their life? Social protection plays a role in climate policy. And indeed, just a few years ago at our COP23, social protection it appeared in one of our mandates. And a couple of days ago, I pointed that out. I'm not going to bore you with the text, although I'm very, very happy to share it. And social protection has been recognized in the international climate negotiations as a really important tool to help manage these risks. And there's a spectrum. Countries all across the world, Indonesia, I think you're a sparkling example, and we have so much to learn from you. Also, Valentina, with all of your experience and case studies. But countries face a whole spectrum of things that they're trying to do. They're planning for the development that they want to see. At the end of the day, all of us want stability. We want our families to be safe, and we want a good life. We want a certain level of welfare and our basic needs to be met. So you have planning, you have implementation of a whole bunch of things, development, cooperation, adaptation. That's what we talk about in climate policy. And then there are also a lot of surprises with climate change, for example. There are some risks that are emerging now that maybe weren't anticipated at the time of planning. And so we also need contingencies. And Valentina, you also highlighted this. having contingency plans in place that can catch people if they're knocked down and prevent them from losing hard-won gains in their lives. Those are so critical to what we talk about in the climate policy realm of adapting and averting and minimizing and addressing these adverse impacts of climate change. I don't know if you can see the slide on the screen, but this is maybe the last thing, and then I'll go back to you, Sönke. Often it's hard to think about what climate change means for countries and especially for vulnerable people. And all of us are vulnerable, and I'm not going to go into that debate. What's really important is to have an idea of what could happen, like almost like scenarios. And what you see in this slide is a made up landscape that represents some place that probably all of us are familiar with. Some of us come from coastal areas or islands. Some of us live in the mountains. Some of us live on plains. Some of us live in dry lands. And what you see with the icons is a variety of climate stressors and a variety of things down across the bottom of the page that can be affected in our lives. We have economic values. We may lose our jobs if a disruption comes, like a big flood. Let's say that we work as fisher folk or farmers. A big flood or a drought can wipe out our jobs, and it can very much affect our savings and things that we need to have our kids in school or to pay for medicine for our parents. There are also things as you go across on the bottom of the slide there are also things that perhaps aren't immediately market values, but which really matter to us. The cohesion of our communities, our sense of belonging and identity, and massive disruptions, some associated with climate change, can really damage those. And we're trying to find ways, and again, bringing it finally back to social protection, there's a lot of hope that this suite of tools can help countries provide that backup system for people so that when disruptions do arise, and they do, and they will, and perhaps even more in the future, that people don't fall all the way down, that they can get back up, that they can adapt and keep moving forward in the things that are most important to their lives. Thanks.
Thank you, Koko. Okay, let me now get to the next panelist, and I also prepared a question. Dear Ibu Aya, so what do you think is actually from also an implementer's perspective, and you very much have that experience, and you also know the different actors that are actually in the space in Indonesia. What is then kind of the added value of engaging in an adaptive social protection approach? Why should implementing agencies or also governments actually invest in adaptive social protection?
Thank you very much, Sönke, for the questions. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, and also good evening, maybe from some of us. So what is actually the added value of adaptive social protection? That is one of the very important questions that we raise to ourselves when we start the new approach for the German government support to the government of Indonesia. Because we learned after 10 years of supporting and accompanying Indonesia's social protection reforms, the evidence told us that it requires more than ordinary social protection to improve the resilient capacity, the individuals and the family. Extreme weather events and other impacts of climate change are actually the cross-cutting risks that affect people's life in any stage of life cycle. It is increasing the exposure of threats to individual and society while making them more complex actually collectively. So then, I mean, if we see from the Indonesia perspective, Indonesia is an excellent showcase to explain above reality. Indonesia's social protection reforms has massively taken place since 2014. Both pillars of social protection, which are social insurance and social security, have been re-established and expanded with better benefit following the life cycle risk, extended the coverage, improving the services and accessibility. However, of course, it is significant contribute to poverty reduction, but not sufficient in responding to the disaster. Based on above reality, we also understand then social protection alone will not be able to solve the systemic poverty caused by multiple risks. Indonesia is archipelago of opportunities, but in the other side, Indonesia also archipelago of disaster, as Pungky already mentioned and addressed correctly. So then for us, the question, how to really ensure that more integrated and comprehensive approach will be established. What we learn, adaptive social protection is one of promising approach because it is about the innovation and adaptation and also overcome the standalone strategies and also to better streamline, align, and also coordinate different social protection intervention in the context of disaster and climate risk. As Valentina also mentioned, that there is a lot of work in silo. The three different areas actually not working well, although might be a lot of initiative already established. So then the question, it is a time for us to start to invest in more coherent approach, which will ensure more integrated, concerted government strategies and policies, which can help to also build the synergies between different sectors, maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of public service and delivery, and also avoid adverse effects across sectors, which in our opinion, this is not inventing the wheel, but start from what Indonesia already has. So specifically, for example, what is the benefit that we invest on the adaptive social protection? It is increased efficiency and effectiveness of sectoral program, because we understand that each government institution already has their own budget and also priorities concerning the topic. For example, for social protection program, Indonesia is one of the countries that we believe has advanced social protection. But in the other side, the social protection stakeholder doesn't really connect with the other area, which is climate change and also disaster risk. And under this new approach, we believe to bring all key stakeholders to sit and discuss together and also build the consensus, which based on the priority needs of the Indonesia, not just the government of Indonesia, but the population, the society. Why the society is very important? Because once again, climate change and natural disaster are the cross-cutting risks, which mean that could be happen in any stage of life. Without any inclusion approach, then, for example, we also not really sure whether the program that available, and then at the end of the day, then realize the program actually couldn't really reach the right population. As Pungky already mentioned, one of the issue, for example, data. So building integrated data, reliable data, but also adaptive data that could respond very fast and easy when it comes to disaster, that one of the most fundamental issue. That I think one of the rationale to invest more on the adaptive social protection. So the keyword here is about the adaptations and also innovation. And then of course, there are several questions that we need to answer together. What is exactly the program, the approach that able to tackle all its threats? What is the prerequisite condition that must be established to allow the program working effectively in cross-sectoral? And of course, then the question, never-ending question about how will the program be financed and where is the source of financing? And then who are the leading actors? Because Indonesia's situation, one of the other key points that sometimes could tackle the effectiveness of the cooperation is about decentralization. Whatever the policy decide at the central level doesn't mean that might be automatically will be implemented successfully at the regional level. I hope that respond to your question, Sonke. Thank you.
Yeah, and you added even more questions. So please also panelists interact and think about the questions that Ibu Aya posed to us. I think we will have chance to at least respond to some of them. Let me now move to Dr. Simone Sandholm. Can you maybe tell us a little bit also what is the role of science in this and academic actors? And also tell us a little bit on how this can actually also help some of the implementation debates moving forward.
Yes, thanks, Sönke, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm glad to be here. Well, frankly speaking, science is here to answer all the questions that Ibu Aya just raised and even more questions, because as we've all heard, there are adaptive social protection is a quite recent concept. So it's quite new and we need scientific evidence. I guess it was Pungky in the beginning who said we need the evidence base for adaptive social protection to also make countries and then regions pick up on the topic and then really make it a case. So we need that, and here science has to contribute. And I would see two particular areas or two particular points where science needs to support and needs to bring something to the table. The first one is a methodological one. So yes, adaptive social protection is a concept, but it is yet lacking very comprehensive frameworks that then can be implemented. And those frameworks, that framework wouldn't also need to relate to the different sectors that are making adaptive social protection. So it has to relate to disaster risk management, it has to relate to climate change research, and also to what is already there in social protection. And that is something which can be done, which is still not yet fully developed, and that is something that science has to contribute to, and that scientists definitely are already contributing to. But sometimes it's not so easy to break those silos, as we've already heard a few times earlier today in this session. And then secondly, we need to contribute to the body of evidence. I guess it was in the very first webinar last week, I hope you all were there, and where the point was raised why social protection, not even adaptive social protection, isn't yet that much taken up by IPCC. And that is basically because there's not yet many publications that the IPCC could then refer to. So we need more of that. We need more evidence. We need more case studies that also are then critically assessed. There are publications out there like from the World Bank and other international organizations, but some critically sound scientific assessments sometimes would contribute here to also make the case on best practices, maybe sometimes even worst practices. You can also learn from something that has not worked out. To then also in the end allow for drawing, for instance, some conclusions on the transferability to Indonesia or other countries, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. We can also learn from what has already been done, and for policymakers, it may even contribute to the credibility of the concept if they see it has already been picked up, it has already worked somewhere else. So that's where I definitely see science. And a third point that came to my mind when hearing Valentina speaking is I feel science also has the responsibility of breaking academic silos. Because if we just if I'm coming from a more disaster risk perspective, then I learn what's going on, the climate change debates, but the same is now true for the social protection domain. So if we would implement also or deal more with that topic in academic education and learn how to work together, that certainly can contribute to later supporting countries in working across silos, working across ministries.
Thank you very much, Simone. So before I'm reading out the questions that are already coming in, and please be reminded, submit them. And I learned you can also submit them to Facebook. So we have all options. Let me also give the chance to the last two remaining panelists to maybe react to some of the things you've heard before. but also to maybe some specific questions. So one is would be again taking the Indonesian perspectives, and Ibu Aya, you said also what are the actors that need to engage on an adaptive social protection approach, and what can be their function? Are there any perspectives on say what are these kind of key groups that need to be part of an adaptive social protection approach? Who's pushing it? Who's maybe not pushing it? Who needs to be engaged? What type of ministries, for example, need to be engaged in these kind of debate? And there would be a question that goes to our honorable Deputy Minister, if that's okay. And I would also have a question to Valentina. And that you have a very good overview about different debates on adaptive social protection and related debates. We already heard that it's there a few keywords thrown into the discussions. But what do you think are some of the major stumbling stones why it's maybe not happening? If you could answer that, I would be most grateful. But let's start with the Indonesian perspectives.
Thank you, Sönke. I think the idea of ASP is relatively new in Indonesia. And we already have experience from, let's say, since tsunami 2004, that actually lots of social assistance programs and then social insurance programs intervene into helping the Indonesian society who are impacted by the disasters itself. Then it came to our mind that actually whatever disasters you are having, helping the people, the impacted people, get back on their feet is actually the more important thing to do. And then this is actually comes to the idea that actually maybe we need to streamline all the programs that we have already, because Indonesia has already quite complete programs in social protection. Let's say, for example, for the social assistance, we had food security programs through our food subsidy program. We have also programs for utilities, electricity, gas, things like that. Also education, health, basic infrastructure through community development or whatever kind of programs available. So in terms of the coverage, it is already complete. It is already available for all aspects of human life. The problem is actually how we can adjust and use them so that it can address the specific needs of the impacted people. Yeah, so this is actually why I think the role of government, who has the big responsibility in all addressing these issues and then delivering through our own national budget, will be very important. Because since the concept is quite new, international donor communities and financial institutions are now trying to start introducing the idea to the government. That's one thing. The second thing, for the scientists and the academia, actually, this is actually not unheard of before. If you go to Indonesian universities and you ask about, do you have any curriculum for adaptive social protection? What? What's that? I haven't heard of that yet. But if you're talking about health insurance, infrastructure, things like, yes, they can answer the questions very easily. So we also find that actually CSOs, they have resources, but very limited and specifically addressed to specific groups. For example, the vulnerables, the elderly, things like that. These are actually the resources that I see available within the country. But then again, making everyone to think about one concept. If, for example, we have something big like a pandemic right now, yeah, I lost the battle already, Sönke, 6 months ago when I introduced to the ministers that actually do not use any other programs, because we have already quite a complete set of programs in social protection to address the issues. But again, as Ibu Aya said, lots of politicians who now become the ministers are willing to provide new programs, yeah, which is actually alien to them before. Yeah, so this is actually raised the complication in the adaptive social protection implementation in Indonesia. Now, actually, it is time for us, yeah, with the help of the SPP program from GIZ, to think about how we really identify, evaluate, and provide the evidence actually what is effective, what is not effective. Yeah. For example, Valentina was talking about the data itself. Okay, in the past, we are trying to promote the improvement of data through all local governments. They don't like to do that because there is no political benefit of improving data. If you spend some money for improving data, what is actually the political benefit for me to do so? Now they are crying for help to improve the data. Then I told them actually, okay, let's do it together and let's work together with our statistics office and many other institutions, academia, to work on the complete idea of adaptive social protection. So from the Indonesian perspective, I think the government has to lead the design, the introduction, the socialization, things like that. But then again, we should ask many other stakeholders to work with us. The government cannot do it alone by itself. Thank you, Senka.
Yeah, thank you very much. Over to Valentina.
Fantastic. And I'm going to weave a few things that Pungky has been saying into my intervention because they're absolutely very relevant. So that in terms of the challenges and the stumbling blocks, why are we not there yet? Well, one of the major ones actually, COVID could be able to help us with, which is the fact that we've been covering our eyes in terms of not realizing that exactly shocks play such a big role in determining life outcomes of people, and especially the poorest and most vulnerable. And that ultimately that concept that we're all potential recipients of social protection, there might be a time when we're in need either across our life cycle or due to other reasons, and economic recession, etc. So thinking more broadly, taking a step back and thinking about that longer term preparedness. What can we do now to make sure that this will not happen again and that we're not in that firefighting post-COVID situation that many countries have found themselves in? There's an issue about collaboration across sectors, and some of it is also linked to these aspects we've been discussing of us sort of getting stuck on words sometimes, and but this framework, that framework, adaptive, shock sensitive social protection, shock responsive social protection, so many different words, and we end up giving up. Well, ultimately we should be focusing on what those words mean, what is the concept behind them, where it's about incorporating, understanding risks and how they affect our societies and our people, and how we can be working across sectors to be addressing that in a collaborative way, because we'll be helping each other achieve our outcomes. So not focusing on the words, but focusing on the tools each of us have, the systems, the practical implementation aspects that we could be, how can DRM and social protection data be kind of feeding into each other, for example, and working together, and some countries have been moving in that direction. There's a big stumbling block around just capacity and our systems. I mean, some countries have got a stronger range of programs that work together in an integrated way to address different risks. In some countries, that is hardly the case. There's very little to build on. There's very little human capacity, especially at lower levels of implementation. And just overcoming that is a fundamental step zero. In order to reach the delta of adaptive social protection, we need a stronger social protection system to build on. And Indonesia has taken great strides in that direction, which is now why now you can focus on the delta. And there's another very big challenge, which is linked to something you were mentioning, Pungky, which is around the political economy and owning the risks. Who is owning the risks, especially given that the financing implications that come with them, and what each actor thinking, what is in it for me? Kind of, why should I be pre-investing in this? Kind of, this is your, and it's infighting between different ministries, different levels of administration in terms of who owns that risks, who bears the cost of that risk, especially if it's early action. And then that links to the last point, which is what you were also mentioning, both of you, Dr. Sandholm and Pungky on the evidence, the trying. I mean, not that policy making is just about evidence. Everyone in our sector now talks about evidence-informed decision making rather than evidence-based policy making. Kind of acknowledging that evidence plays a role, but it's not the primary factor, but that evidence of the effectiveness of early action, the value for money of being investing in systems in advance, and how that pays off, for example, in a crisis like this. And I think, again, COVID will help to build some of that evidence in terms of where early investment has paid off, countries being able to intervene before coping capacities were so depleted that people had sold off assets, not able to return to their livelihoods. That can make a big difference in terms of ultimate impacts on economic recessions in a country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think this already gives us quite a complete picture on some of the challenges and also some of the content that needs to be tackled as part of the adaptive social protection concept. I would now open up to some of the questions received from our viewers, and I probably read out first the ones that were individually addressed to the different panelists to get you prepared, and then also some general ones that everyone can contribute. So one question going to Koko is particularly when we look at the challenges of slow onset events. So this kind of slowly creeping climate change impacts. What is the potential of an ASP approach in that? So that's a question that goes to you. We also have like questions going to Valentina. I'm reading it out. So you illustrated problems of an individual from childhood to old age in a covariate shock cycle. Could education solve some of the problems? So the role of education in ASP, also from a resource perspective, so a resource efficiency perspective. Is that actually a better investment, if I may rephrase that question? And also, how can actually the outcome of such ASP policies, how can they be monitored? I think that's also a question that goes to everyone, but also specifically to you, Valentina. And then maybe some two broader questions is, how does ASP actually differ from integrated risk management? And what might be the potential of ecosystem and nature-based solutions in an ASP approach? And the other one is also around the role of the informal sector. So through, I say, government strategies, I think the first engagement point is like with the formal sector, but what is about the informal? And what role can it play in an ASP approach, but also specifically, but also social protection in general? With that, I would first go to Koko, and please, other panelists, become prepared. I'll come to you. Koko, first question goes to you.
Thank you. And thanks so much for the great question about the potential of adaptive social protection when we're thinking about slow onset events in climate change. So I'm going to answer this question first from a policy perspective. What are we doing under the UNFCCC process? And then I'm going to switch into, there's so much unknown, so I'm going to switch to a personal perspective. So first of all, slow onset events, I showed you a slide, a landscape. These involve a whole bunch of things that we're just learning about. Glacial melt, the change of freshwater regimes, shifts in biomes, sea level rise, ocean acidification. These are major large-scale changes in our Earth systems. And it's kind of new because as long as humans have been around, the systems have been kind of the way that we understand them today. We're already at approximately a degree above pre-industrial levels of greenhouse gas emissions. But the world that we have today, we kind of assume that there's fresh water, that we have groundwater, that we live in a forested area, or that we live in a grasslands area. Biomes, and we learned this from the special reports of the IPCC recently, a large amount of biomes on our Earth are potentially going to shift. So for example, if you were living in a forested biome, that might shift with climate change over time towards grasslands. And. So we have these very long, well, somewhat longer term processes that are unfolding, while our more familiar extreme events are happening. And all of these things set people like you and me, people across the world, especially low-income households that are particularly sensitive to disruptions, it really sets us back. And I think now I'm switching. Oh, wait, one little advertisement. Slow onsets are part of a work stream of a committee that was set up under the UNFCCC process, under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. So our executive committee is looking at slow onset events, and part of that is fostering greater knowledge. This is all things that we have to learn a lot more about. So now I'm switching to just a personal hat because there's so much we don't know. I imagine that countries might find a lot of help in adaptive social protection tools and systems, because the shocks aren't only confined to the already problematic shocks of extreme events and economic cycle and the ups and downs of health and all of those things that people already struggle with in their lives. We lay on top of this, with climate change, increasing magnitude and frequency of extreme events. I mean, just look at COVID-19. In Oregon, a state where some of my family members live, there are massive, almost out of control forest fires at a time when there's a global pandemic. Those two things overlapped make dealing with the situation extremely difficult. And municipal leaders and state leaders and federal leaders are faced with that kind of disruption. At the end of the day, they want to keep people safe. And then they also have to get people back on their feet again. So that's a big challenge. We're probably going to see more of that in the future. And again, just to bring it around to adaptive social protection, we need to make sure that we maintain as many, Valentina, you just mentioned assets. We need to make sure that we maintain as many opportunities for people in their social systems to deal with these disruptions, particularly over the longer term, because our baselines are changing. What was normal a few decades ago, we may see a different kind of normal changing as our baseline shifts. Of course, climate change isn't the only mega trend in the world, but it's a really big one. And again, for social systems and our human timeframes, some of these big changes might not go away. They may kind of take on a systemic, permanent type of feel. And I'm talking only in human timeframes, not geological scale. But again, social protection is a way to help buffer people from those disruptions, which get bigger and more variation over time.
Thank you. I think that was a comprehensive answer. Valentina, do you have any perspectives on the question posed to you?
Yes. So let me start from the education question, and I'm going to take a step back from it because, I mean, we've been talking about adaptive social protection, but when we just focus on core kind of routine social protection, one of our tenets in our sector is that this can't be alienated from other sectors. There's no one silver bullet. Social protection is not going to solve all problems, but we can be working across sectors to be reinforcing each other's outcomes. And social protection can be working hand in hand with the education sector. We can be through scholarship and school meals. We can be kind of ensuring that children are retained in school. We can be conditional cash transfer programs can be designed in a way that they're kind of incentivizing schooling, but recognizing that even conditionality could have adverse effects, and it's been proven and kind of scientifically shown kind of in impact evaluations that labeling cash transfers, just the fact that a cash transfer might be called a child support grant or a grant for education can incentivize kind of children to be using it to enhance schooling outcomes. The incorporation of some sort of behavioral change communication into the delivery of routine cash transfers. So to have an education dimension to the cash transfer program itself as a cash plus add-on. So there's a lot of coherence and linkages when sectors can work together that can enhance outcomes. So I would push in that direction. In terms of the monitoring, there is a bit of a lot of work that we've started doing on this. Definitely, I mean, already routine social protection sometimes struggles to monitor in a way that's truly not just looking at inputs and outputs, but also at outcomes and impacts. And this becomes even more important when we're looking at adaptive social protection. And I can share maybe some resources after this session. I wanted to really quickly pick up the question also on the informal sector, because that has been crucial with COVID, the realization in many countries that we have this vast, what in our sector we call missing middle, of people who were maybe even well above the poverty line before any type of major shock, and that are vulnerable to falling below if and where their livelihoods are affected. So across many countries, people in kind of home-based work or kind of casual labor were the ones that were most affected by this crisis. And again, building our systems to be not necessarily to be protecting them all now, but to be able to protect them if and where a crisis occurs. And kind of that process of even formalization and bringing informal workers into the formal sector will be an important one going forward. The ILO and WIGO have some great resources on this, and within SPACE we've been providing quite a bit of support to countries on this. I'll share some resources on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Actually, one additional question was thrown to the mix, and with that, I think I close the question and answer session. So also the question is, what actually influences the readiness of countries to engage on adaptive social protection? So these kind of change processes, if you have perspectives on that, that would be most helpful. I would now turn to you, Ibu Aya. Do you have any perspectives on the questions posed to the general panel, for example, on the role of ecosystem-based approaches, or the role of the informal sector, or also how to measure the outcomes of such initiatives? Or do you want to react to some of the points you've heard from your co-panelists?
Thank you, Sonke. I think one of very interesting questions that address by the participants, if I'm not mistaken here, that about, I think, of course, Pungky might be the right person to answer that, but let me try to answer from the perspective of the international cooperation here, because we will not call ourselves donor, because we are working on behalf of the governments of Germany. So the questions about how the Indonesian government should monitor the policy that already in place. It is very interesting question, but I would like to remind everyone that once again, when we talk about the adaptive social protection, we don't talk about something new, but we are discussing about the innovation and also the adaptation. I think that is the two keys when we introduce to the government of Indonesia to ensure that everyone understand actually it is require more investment, but doesn't mean that this investment will not be in return in the future. So there is a money that already available, but the most important that how to effectively use and utilize and even optimize the money by ensuring that the individual as the most targeting person here, which is like the individual, because we would like to ensure that the resilient capacity of the individual and also the community will be improved in order to coping the risk because of the disaster and climate change. And what is the most appropriate programs that could support that? That is, I think, still like remaining question to all of us. So how we can monitor that? By ensuring that all key stakeholders involved since the beginning, and the policy must be designing in inclusive way, which means there is a participatory approach. And in the case of Indonesia, to also ensure that the fundamental strategy from the central will be communicated into the regional. For example, by using the community and also the society or association that work closely with the individuals and also with the poor and vulnerable in certain area, in the case of Indonesia, for example. So from the perspective of social protection, of course, how to see that the program will be effectively reached. The social protection program or whatever program that try to put attention to the individual needs must fulfill at least 5 principles. So the program itself has to be available. If the program then available, then how about like the coverage of the program? So the coverage and the benefit then becomes the second question. If the programs is available, inclusive, but the coverage and benefit itself is not inclusive, then means that the program itself is not inclusive. And how about the accessibility? We talk about the person with disabilities. They have like a very particular needs. Under the COVID-19 response, we could see there is like one like concerning approach for person with disability. And this is also remaining questions when we talk about the coping strategies for risk because of disaster. And also transparency, because once again, we talk about like huge amount of money that the government already allocated, and accountability, and also ensuring that will be sustainable, will be in the long run. So which means at the end of the day, like participatory approach and also involving all the stakeholders that has a role and responsibility on this 3-dimension area on social protection, disaster risk management, and also climate change adaptation becomes very crucial, especially speaking from the perspective of Indonesia and also I think in the other country where sometimes the role and responsibility might be overlapping, as Valentina already mentioned, and as Pungky also mentioned, it's a lot about like a political winning decision at the end of the day, because once again, social protection is not the political topic, it is the needs of the population. Thank you, Sonke.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we are also actually approaching already the end of the session. So I would ask all panelists to prepare their concluding statement. Your one flashpoint, maybe 30 seconds. And I'll ask you how you would define success in an adaptive social protection approach. So what would be your one thing by which you say this has been a successful endeavor? But before I do that, I would give you the floor, Pungky, also to respond to some of the questions and the perspectives you've heard on the panel. And other panelists, please prepare your concluding statement.
Thank you, Sonke. I think Indonesia has lots of social assistance programs being implemented in response to the COVID, and then that makes us having lots of headache. So I think what I'm going to conclude actually, what we need in preparing the design of adaptive social protection is that actually we need to have programs that is broad-based. It covers nationwide. It may start from the routine programs that Valentina has mentioned earlier, and it should be simple to administer, and then it should be adaptable to different needs, for example, the climate change sensitivity or any other kinds of disasters. And then the second thing that I would like to propose is that actually we need to improve the governance system of these programs so that we may create the accountability of the programs itself. Then we would be able to invite many other institutions to mobilize more financial resources. Once we agreed on this issue, then I would say actually there is an ingredient for having a say that actually whether this program will be successful or not. Thank you, Sonke.
Okay, so that was already a concluding statement. Thank you for that. I would actually ask Simone to start the conclusions. So what would be the success factor?
To me, the success factor relates very much also to the very first question that was raised. So to me, an integrated approach of adaptive social protection goes even beyond the 3, let's say, bubbles that we've seen in the very first graph or they may, you know, let's put it differently, they contain even more. So they, to me, also definitely beyond the government leadership, which is to me one of the building blocks of adaptive social protection, also includes informal mechanisms, because in Indonesia, disaster response is very much related to informal mechanisms. The same would be true in any other country, but at the same time, those community-based approaches very often also deal with ecosystem-based approaches. So ecosystems play a crucial role in reducing impacts from disaster. We've seen it in Koko's slide as well. It was in there, but they also play a crucial role in reducing impacts from climate change. So it has to be a truly integrative approach, even beyond the core topics of risk, climate, and social protection.
Okay, thank you, and also for elegantly answering the one missing question there. Thank you for that. Koko, I actually would ask you, how would you define success in this endeavor?
Thank you. Agree with what has been said till now. From a climate policy perspective, wouldn't it be neat if countries wrote their national adaptation plans and included elements that they would like to see or they want to do in social protection? And I mentioned national adaptation plans because they play a special role in the climate policy area for adaptation. The Green Climate Fund provides up to €3 million for any developing country that's writing its national adaptation plan. And afterwards, at least in the climate finance mechanism, I know the world of finance is very, very big, but in the world of climate finance, those national adaptation plans then signal these are our country's priorities, and our financial mechanism then kind of respects those priorities and the kinds of work that is supported, and that would be terrific. At a more meta level, success would be a little bit like what you were saying, and many others, Simone and others, that social protection really goes across across a whole spectrum of preventing and preparing, planning and implementing, and having contingency arrangements in place so that vulnerable people don't get knocked down in a way that they can't get back up. That's incredibly important for people and their families, and for the bigger picture as well, for what countries are trying to do in terms of keeping a stable place for people to live that's safe and that can also provide welfare.
Thank you very much. Ibu Aya, can you give me your one success factor? What would you like to see coming out of this? Maybe also for Indonesia?
From my point of view, I think one of the key factors for the success is ensuring that a fundamental strategy and innovation for expanding social protection against risk from extreme weather events and natural disaster are available in Indonesia. And this is why the developments of the fundamental strategy, such as the National Roadmap for Adaptive Social Protection, which will ensure that the government of Indonesia will have the foundations to establish the most suitable and the most profitable programs for the population in order to increase the resilience and for the future long run also improve the quality livelihood of the population in Indonesia. I know that is a very optimistic, but I do believe, because Indonesia is the country, as I already said in the beginning, archipelago of opportunities, and we believe that mission impossible that always happening in Indonesia. So finger crossed, there is a dream which we believe that with this fundamental strategy, there will be also enforcing a better coordination, a better streamline of the program, a better planning and financing in the future, and also integrated data and reliable data, and also management of data itself. And also the program could also be used as the early warning system instrument, for example, that automatically available when it comes to the disaster. Thank you, Sondre.
Yeah. Thank you. 30 seconds, Valentina.
Fantastic. And building on what everybody else had said, I love this last optimistic note is just, yeah, picking up those glasses and looking at our sector through the glasses of that other sector to kind of get that focus on what would change, what would I do differently now that I have these glasses on. And for the social protection sector specifically, it's about kind of asking ourselves along those different building blocks I showed you at policy level, program design level, implementation level, what is it that we can be doing differently from that perspective? What is it that other sectors can, what tools can they lend us? How can we be building on what they have? How can they build on what we have? How can we not kind of have these two parallel systems that don't speak to each other, but working together in an adaptive, flexible way? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not wearing glasses, I'm wearing contact lenses. And that's what it's ultimately about, making contact. So thank you very much for these engaging discussions, all the questions posed, and all the perspectives shared. I want to share with you actually upcoming opportunities to engage with the Summer Academy format. So we will have our next webinar on the 21st of September. We will actually look at the role of non-state actors, and I think it's very, very important. It has been raised already. The role of different stakeholder groups in this approach. We will also have a webinar on the 22nd, looking at the future of social protection, looking at different trends, and trying to picture how this whole community or how this whole debate is going. And then on the 23rd, we will conclude by discussing the trends in climate change, vulnerability, and social protection. So thank you very much again, and keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.